Welcome to today's National Landcare Webinar, a discussion with Allan Savory. My name's Brett DeHare. The National Landcare Webinar is a regular series by the National Landcare Facilitator that aims to cover a diverse range of speakers and topics relevant to the Landcare movement. If you're experiencing any technical or audio problems during today's webinar, please call Redback Support on 1800 733 416. The number is also on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Just to give you some background as to how the webinar will work today, you should be seeing the video feed with both Allan and myself on the left of your screen. The PowerPoint presentation is on the right of your screen. And to ask a question of Allan for the Q&A session, which will be at the end of the presentation, please click on the Ask a Question box, which you'll see at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and type in your question. Please try and get those questions through before we start the Q&A session. It'll just make that a little bit easier for us. There is also a survey tab towards the top of the screen. Please help us by filling out that survey at the end of the webinar to help us plan for future events. Also, there is a link to resources, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. That contains links such as to the Savory Institute and previous National Landcare webinars. Finally, moving on to towards our poll, we've had a great response to today's webinar with over 700 registrations from people across the country and internationally. Around about half of the registrations are individual primary producers, Landcare groups, farming systems groups. We've also then got CMAs, NRM groups, government agencies, agribusiness, and obviously a range of interested individuals. So it's been a really positive feedback. Now, just to give us a feel of where people are joining us from today, you'll see a poll pop up on your screen in a moment, and please click on the box that relates to the state or territory that you're joining us from. We'll leave that open for a moment before we then close it and share the results with everyone. Another 5-10 seconds, if everyone could just click on those boxes. And if we could close those results off and share them. Thanks very much. Obviously a great coverage from across the country. Now, without any further delay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Allan Savory. He's had a long career in the field of holistic management and will be well known to many people joining us with today's webinar. Allan was born in what is today Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. He pursued an early career as a research biologist and a game ranger. Allan has had a long career spanning many continents as a resource management consultant, developing sustainable solutions. In 2003, Allan was awarded the prestigious Banksia International Award for the person or organisation doing the most for the environment on a global scale. Allan is based in the US, but is no stranger to Australia, having visited over many years conducting lectures and workshops. It's my pleasure to hand over to Allan Savory.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brett. I guess it's good afternoon, or we are in the afternoon. Most of the people on this webinar, I gather, will understand the agricultural problem, as I call it, the seriousness of it, so I'm only going to summarize there. Fundamentally, agriculture is not just crop production, it's the production of food and fiber from the world's land and waters. Without agriculture, we couldn't have this webinar. You cannot have a church, you cannot have a university, any of the trappings of civilization. So agriculture has made all of that possible, but the situation we have today is that globally agriculture is producing far more eroding soil than food every year, and massive global biomass burning of grasslands, periodic burning of tropical forests, and many other things, including the great environmental damage from feedlots where animals are being fed grain, etc. If we put all of these together, it is very clear that agriculture is the most destructive industry that we have. more destructive than any extractive mining or anything else. So this is extremely serious when it is fundamental to all economies, all nations, and certainly to maintaining all cities. And the control of agriculture has shifted to cities because that's where the bulk of our populations are, policies are formulated, etc. So we face an extremely serious global position with it. And what makes it most dangerous is that even after we discover benign sources of energy, as we have to do, climate change will continue because of agriculture if we do not address it. So webinars like this become extremely important for all of our cities, city folks, for everybody. Now, you mentioned in introducing me that I've been working on the problem for a long time, and this is true. I began 58 years ago, roughly, becoming very concerned, first as a wildlife biologist, but then gradually as my understanding increased, realizing that the habitat destruction or land destruction I was seeing that was endangering wildlife was exactly the same thing that had led to the demise of many civilizations in all regions of the world, and that poor land through our management means increasing frequency, severity of floods and droughts, poverty, violence, abuse of women and children, war, and eventually climate change. And a major component of this is the what is called desertification, and that I covered in the TED Talk, where I pointed out that about 2/3 of the world is in fact desertifying. And I had it then a picture of the globe up, but now I think we've got a picture of Australia, and you can see how this affects also most of Australia. The main point here is that we did not realize, we talked about desertification occurring in arid and semi-arid regions, but if you look at London and Johannesburg, they have about the same rainfall. And no matter how bad the agricultural practices, say, around a city like London, it does not turn into desert. The same agricultural practices around a city like Johannesburg, it can turn into desert very easily. So we had totally different climates in these areas, and we had to come up with a new concept for that, which I had to give a new name, and I called it a brittleness scale. So environments right across the world fall on a scale of 1 to 10, from non-brittle, meaning really almost perennial humidity. Whether the rainfall is high or low, it's humid almost every day. And no matter what we do, the rainfall remains largely effective, soil remains covered very easily. It's almost impossible to create millions of hectares of bare soil between the plants. And then we shift across that scale where the rainfall is low or high, and increasingly the humidity becomes very sharply divided between humid months and dry months, dry periods, as I say, whether high or low, and it becomes very easy to expose the bulk of the soil over millions of hectares of land by our practices in grazing or cropland or whatever. And working on that problem, we initially faced the situation where it was blamed entirely on livestock. And I grew up believing that, being taught that. I was taught that at university, and that was entrenched in us. And in the TED Talk, I explained how that had led me to making the first of many blunders in my life, but the biggest one, where I wrongly interpreted and proved we had too many elephants in areas we were setting aside to form national parks, future national parks, and that was an extremely unpopular finding in my research. So we had my work checked out by a team of experts, our government did, and our government found that I was right and proceeded to kill over 40,000 elephants in the following years, but the problem got worse. So there was something else amiss. And then when I went to the United States, I found that their national parks and research sites and so on, where there had been no livestock and no large animal life at all for well over 50 to 100 years, the desertification of the land was actually as bad as anything you're seeing in Australia or we were seeing in Africa. And that's what led me to eventually concluding that we had no tool in our tool bag as humans. We're a tool-using animal, and we could not address that with any technology even imaginable. Fire was causing it by exposing soil. Resting land in these seasonal environments, as I see all over Australia, is extremely damaging and leading to desertification. It led us then to understanding, well, there is no other tool available to scientists, no matter what profession we train in, and so we had to introduce livestock to rectify that problem, but then faced the dilemma of how to do so, because we'd had thousands of years of extremely knowledgeable pastoralists herding and bunching their animals, but it had created the great man-made deserts of the world. And then we'd had over 100 years of modern range science, particularly emanating from the United States and in southern Africa and in Australia, and that had accelerated desertification. So at that point, realizing that there was great complexity involved in the wildlife, the soils, the vegetation, the seasonal rainfall, etc., we needed some way of dealing with that complexity, and I simply took 300 years of military experience of immediate battlefield planning and how armies had learnt to address that very complicated situation with constantly changing goalposts, and I adapted that using a simple chart and a very methodical planning process where you break the problem up into small segments that build on one another, and always the best possible plan at that moment in time emerges. And that worked immediately. Now, when we discovered that in the 60s, I was getting some extremely good results, amazing results, but there wasn't consistency. And in science, as people know, if we're not getting consistent results, there's something missing still. And the lack of consistency, we began to realize, was because of social issues, economic issues, other things affecting the situation. And that's when the word holistic came into holistic planned grazing. And we then discovered that we had to go much deeper than just the planned grazing. So we can discuss that. People can ask questions about that, because I don't want to make this a long lecture series from me. Now, when we discovered that we were getting those erratic results and began working on that, as I say, it led us to understanding we needed to address social, cultural, and environmental complexity. And in 1984, approximately, a missing piece fell into place, and we were able to address that full complexity. And since about 1984, as long as people do manage any situation holistically, we've seen encouraging success and so on. We have had thousands of people misunderstand it and try to treat it as some sort of management system, and that, of course, doesn't deal with the complexity and doesn't work. So we can discuss that. But I need to point out here that this now affects all aspects of agriculture. When past civilizations failed because their agriculture failed, we believed it was just because their agriculture failed. And I think Rebecca Costa explained it well in her book, The Watchmans Rattle, where she described correctly that those past civilizations failed not only because of their agriculture, but because their societies could not address the increasing complexity of agricultural destruction of the environment and rising population. So their societies began to turn increasingly to faith and sacrifices and to shelve the problems for future generations. And I think if we look at it globally, that's what we're doing today. We're turning to turn not just to faith, but also to amusement, entertainment, enormously distracting things, and we're shelving these problems for future generations. So it becomes extremely urgent that we don't do so and begin to have many, many things like this webinar where we discuss it. So we can discuss that and people can ask questions about that. I think it's clear to any thinking person today that management needs to be holistic. It cannot continue to be reductionist. And the problem with the past and our current management, and this includes management on the farms, on the ranches, with the pastoralists, but also it is management when you look at laws, regulations, and policies of government, and they all need to be holistic. So I should perhaps explain what that means.
And also, Alan, just in there, I've just had a question come in about, could you explain the difference between a holistic goal and a holistic context?
Yes, that was one of my mistakes. When we realized we needed to manage holistically, we didn't know how to do so. And every human decision made, if we look at it, I'll put this up, when we look at how humans make decisions, whether we're in a sophisticated team or we're a Bushman family in the Kalahari Desert, every one of our conscious decisions is to an objective or a goal. And we can have missions and visions, but you can't reach them other than through different objectives and goals. Now, an objective or a goal needs a context. So if I say to you, Brett, I'm going to light a fire, should I? I have an objective, lighting a fire. Should I light it? You have no idea, without asking me why. What is the context? If it's a cold night and there's a fireplace and I'm going to light it, that's great. If I'm just going to light it in the studio, you're going to have a catastrophe. You're going to have unintended consequences. All right, so every objective on the farm, in the family, in government policies needs a context. If you look at the management by humans over thousands of years, every conscious action has that objective or goal, but if you ask what is the context or probe further, you'll find its need. What was the context for buying that jacket you have? What was the context?
I didn't have a jacket.
You didn't have a jacket, so you needed one. You see, it's need or desire. We need food, or we desire to build a bridge, or whatever it is. Or if it's government policy, and many, many actions on the farm are to address a problem. Well, need, desire, or addressing a problem is fine as a context if you're going to build a bridge, build a building, build a plane, make something. But if you're managing, you cannot escape the fact that you're always dealing with cultural, social complexity. That's extremely complex, even the family is, environmental complexity and economic complexity. So we didn't have a context for our management decisions. And that's why you see incredible blunders around the world, unintended consequences to agricultural policies. You're experiencing that in Australia. Every country is. Right? So we didn't know what would give us a context. And we had nothing in any religion in the world, nothing in any branch of science, nothing in any philosophical writings. We were really almost looking for a vacuum. And slowly that fell into place. And when it did, and we realized we needed a definition or defined context that linked our deepest social and cultural values through things we needed to produce to live lives like that to our life-supporting environment, I made the mistake of calling it a holistic goal. And that's in the textbook on holistic management. And I said holistic is not an adjective, it's one word, it's a new concept. And that didn't work because it had the word goal in there. everybody, and including myself at times, confused it with a goal. So finally I had to go back to what it is and just put that out about a year ago. We put a statement out on our website, and we try and get an insert into the textbook, and wherever it says holistic goal, drop it. That's not working, and just call it a holistic context. So we do that, and that works, and people's understanding grows much more rapidly. So having said that, that makes it easy now to explain what I mean by reductionist management. It's any management, no matter how well intended we are, even if we have a very sophisticated, integrated scientific team that are managing something, agriculture or forming a policy in the Australian government or anything like that, if the objectives of that policy or the objectives or goals of that management have too simplistic a context, and they do everywhere. Humans have always done that. And that then makes the management ultimately reductionist. And the moment we can put our arms around what we're managing, whether it's a national policy or just a farm, and define a national or a family, whatever, holistic context, and begin to make our decisions in that context, we start seeing our actions become achievable, our policies become achievable, not just address symptoms as they do so often today, and not lead to unintended consequences. So that's really what makes any situation holistically managed. And I don't think today any thinking person would argue that management across the board needs to be holistic and to embrace all of our current science as well as traditional knowledge and any other sources of knowledge. You can't ignore them. So that really would define it. And the only other refinement in it is because we find it so difficult with our minds to address the full social complexity, even if we are doing it in context, we have a set of 10 little filters that help your mind to make sure your action is socially, environmentally, economically sound in that context. So I think that's given us some basics. It's profoundly simple, but it's not easy. Many people are looking for too much complexity, so they fail to understand how the process works. And when I say it's not easy, it's because it is a major paradigm shift for us from our thousands of years of reductionist management to managing holistically. And any shift like that for humans is not easy. So I think we can, from that, I mean, I could go on talking, but I'd rather hear, if possible, what people are concerned with, what they're not understanding easily, and try to clear those things.
Thanks very much, Alan. We've got a mile of questions through already. First, there's a couple of questions about a recording. This webinar is being recorded, and there will be a link out to people in due course, and it'll be up on landcarefacilitator.com, my website. Alan, a lot of grazing questions, but firstly, there's a couple around cropping. Basically, how do you implement an holistic approach in a cropping context, given a lot of the discussion is in a grazing framework?
Okay, the first thing you do is you don't enlist a holistic approach. You just start managing holistically. In other words, you change the way you're making decisions. You can't just take an approach to it. We would be arrogant if we thought we were the first people in the world that had thought holistically or tried to take a holistic approach. There is apparently evidence that some of the Native American tribes tried to think 7 generations ahead when they made decisions, and they were deeply conscious of their connection to the environment, but they still damaged the environment and wrecked it. And there's never been a noble savage, because humans have always made decisions that same way. And so what we would do, I'll put the other slide up there, is in a cropping situation, if I was a crop farmer, I would purely say, well, what is my farm? It's this land. It's my family are the decision makers. Is there any other decision maker? No, there isn't. And what is the source of money? Do I have any other money? No, I only have the money I can generate here, because we have to manage land, money, and family, culture, society indivisibly. Like this water is not hydrogen and oxygen, it's water. You can't manage the hydrogen, etc. So I would just say, okay, that I understand what I'm managing, my family, my farm, the money I can generate. Now I would define a holistic context for myself and my family with the decision makers. And that would just simply be, and then there are certain guidelines to it, and people can get help with it, but it's 100% what we need to live the life I want to live and my family want to live. So it would start with, how do you want your life to be, based on what you value most deeply in life, spiritually, materially. And then what do you have to produce to live a life like that? And then what will your land have to look like 500 years from now for your descendants to be living a life like that? So words like sustainable become redundant. Everything is geared to that. That is the context. So when that is defined, I would begin making decisions towards that. And I would have my objective or goal of growing cabbages or corn or raising pigs or chickens or whatever it is, and just make sure all of those actions were in that context. That's it.
There's a few questions here relating to if someone's in a situation that their pastures are already in a highly degraded sense, how do you move? What do you do to actually move forward from that? If
highly degraded
if people
land.
are seeing they're in a situation where my landscape doesn't have the capacity to regenerate.
Okay, let me just add a little bit to the last question, because many people will when I answered what I did with the farm, will say, well, I do that already. If you think deeply, you don't. Let me illustrate that. Most people probably on this webinar, and certainly myself, want to have grass-fed beef because it's more healthy, etc., environmentally sound, health-wise. They want organic food without chemicals and, good nutrition, and they want locally fed food, locally produced food. So these probably everybody on the webinar would support. And so I often ask people then and say, okay, how does that differ from what more than 20 civilizations had in the past? We hadn't discovered coal and oil. We hadn't got modern mechanical agriculture, grass, feedlots, etc. They had 100% locally fed, locally produced food, grass-fed beef, and organic. Everything was organic, but their entire civilizations failed in all regions of the world, including humid. So do you see, we've got to go much deeper than permaculture, organic, biodynamic, any of these wonderful techniques we have. None of them are holistic, and we have to go that deeper level. So having said that, now let me come to your one. If we're dealing with land that can only be corrected with livestock, where the rainfall is seasonal, etc., and if we determine in the decision making that we have to use livestock properly managed, only that can reverse the desertification, but the land is very degraded today. It's actually very simple. We do not have to feed the animals, because you've got to make decisions socially, environmentally, economically right. And if you feed the animals in those situations, you'll damage the economic side of the equation, as it were. So what we do is to plan the grazing, the holistic plan grazing, and begin moving the animals. The easiest way probably for people to grasp that is if we had an area the size of this room, for instance, it doesn't matter what the area, and it was very degraded, and the animals could only be supported by a few desert bushes, leaf fall, twigs, not much food there, grass has disappeared altogether. We would plan that to produce grass. We would time the recovery periods for the needs of grass to stabilize that land, even though there's none there, and we would begin moving the animals. Now, when people say, what do they eat? Well, think of having an area of land and it can only support X animals, but it can support them for a year. If you divide the land in half, it can support them for half the year on half that land. That lets plants on the other half grow. If you divide it into quarter, it can support the animals for quarter of the year on quarter of the land. That lets the plants on 3/4 of the land grow for 3/4 of the year. You see it, you're letting plants grow. So we just divide the land up, bunch the animals and start moving them, but moving them fairly fast and ensuring recovery period for plants. So we get more trampling, breaking of the surface, more plants germinating, establishing, and the animals are adequately fed. And we tested that on the worst land we could find in Zimbabwe before ever going into the major public arena with planned grazing. And we selected the worst land in the country. We trebled the number of animals that land could carry in the first year, and we did it with nothing but planned grazing, no other assistance of any sort, and no feed or seeding or anything, and that just became solid perennial grassland. And we were pushing it hard to see if we could make the planning process fail, and we literally could not make it fail. And we've never had it fail. We've had thousands of people fail to do it, but nobody doing it fail.
Allan, just along those lines, there's a few questions here relating to, you mentioned earlier about resting country, and people seem a little bit confused as to what you're talking about as to, resting doesn't work yet. How does that fit in with what you were just talking about?
All right, let me put another picture up here that will help. Yes, I can understand the confusion here, and it confused me for years. All right, if this picture has come up, has this picture come up? Yeah? All right, so on one side of this land, we have land that is overgrazed, people are ignorant, greedy, overstocking, overgrazing, and the other side of this fence, we have the best of management the Western world knows how. There's been no livestock for about 70, 80 years, no large animals grazing. They've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on soil conservation measures, check dams, swales, or whatever one calls the various soil conservation measures, and yet you can't tell the difference between these two bits of land after all that time. And the reason is that any land in the world will always, the plant community, the life on it, the nature of the soil will always reflect the biggest influence on that land over the previous years, 50, 100 years, whatever. And in this case, it's been a long time. And the main influence on this land is rest. So the side that has the livestock on it, there's too few animals wandering around. They do not disturb the soil in any way. They do not disturb the vegetation. They merely overgraze plants, and they overgraze very few plants because there's very few animals on the land. The other side of this fence, there's been no overgrazing, no disturbance, so the plants have largely killed themselves because they're animal dependent and there weren't animals to keep them alive. And the plant composition, the amount of bare soil, everything is about the same. So despite these massive intervention of technology or the livestock, it didn't matter. The biggest influence was resting the land. So we had to come up with a new term for that. Total rest is very seldom used. It occurs on some mountaintops, some steep gorges, or in research plots, places like that. But what's happening over almost all of Australia, as I see when I go around, over most of the world, the United States, is we're partially resting the land at too high a level while animals are overgrazing plants. Now, there's confusion on this throughout the scientific literature, because in the range science profession, thousands of dissertations were written where people studied grazed and ungrazed land and didn't realize you can't graze land. So just that simple fact makes all those thousands of dissertations almost useless to us, because you can only graze plants. And people didn't study that. But a pasture researcher Voisin in France did study that, and I picked up on his work, and he was the person who discovered that overgrazing of plants, contrary to thousands of years of belief and the belief of range science, is not due to animal numbers. It's only due to the time of exposure of the plants and re-exposure of the plants to severe grazing. And that severe grazing, which is condemned, is actually highly beneficial. Most of our best grasses have to be grazed severely to keep them alive. So Voisin discovered that, and we were then able to bring that into managing holistically.
And then just to move, before I move on to fire, there were a few other questions in that area relating to is there an optimum herd size, and how do you reconcile the I suppose the impact of animal numbers on soil condition and compaction?
There isn't an optimum herd size that we know of. I'll try and put up this picture of, is that a picture of 25,000 sheep in one flock? If that's come up, I don't know. And that's the largest I've seen people managing holistically go to at the moment. That's in Patagonia, and those people are doing a very thorough job. It's one of our first learning hubs around the world, one of the early ones, and they measured a 50% improvement of the production on that land in the first year. So when you say how big a herd or how large a herd, that's like asking me how long is a piece of string. I don't know. All I do know is the larger the herd, the more rapid the land recovery. So we do try to go to large herds wherever we can, and if we can't go to large herds because of the small size of the land or whatever, then we have to go to try and use higher density by packing the animals together with fencing or herding or whatever. But we need the physical impact of the animals to overcome the major cause of desertification, which is overresting the land. Even if we continue to overgraze plants, we actually get land recovery.
Allan, a few questions here in relation to fire. Is all fire bad? And could you just maybe unpack that a little bit in an Australian context where...
No, not all fire is bad. I do like cooked food. And we do use fire on our land in Zimbabwe, where I live half the year. We use fire to create fire breaks. It's our most economical way of creating fire breaks to prevent fire. What I should say is that no fire lit by a human is natural. Okay, so we need to relook at our use of fire. The main reason we've used fire as extensively as we have, and it's been devastating for climate change, it's a major contributor to climate change, is because we were trying to keep grasslands alive once we had killed off most of the animal life. The grasslands of Australia and the world used to be maintained by animals with very infrequent fire, very infrequent, only caused by lightning and occasionally maybe some other accidental cause or a volcanic eruption. If it was lightning fire, it usually coincided with rains, didn't go far. So according to Flannery's research, most of Australia, according to the pollen record, used to be fire-phobic vegetation. After the arrival of humans and the killing off of most of the animal life and its replacement with fire, most of Australia has become a fire-dependent vegetation. And the same in Africa, the same in America, elsewhere. So we need to understand the desperate, urgent need to return the bulk of the world, about 2/3 of the world's land that is seasonal rainfall, to being animal maintained rather than fire maintained. So nothing wrong with fire, except that we've got to cut out most of the use of fire today.
Allan, probably then just moving to the southern parts of Australia, how does your approach work in some of the southern environments which are annual pasture based as opposed to perennial
You mean
pasture.
annual rangelands? You're talking of grasslands?
Yes, sorry.
Well, again, I don't have an approach, so I'm going to keep trying to keep the learning going. But if you manage holistically, it applies everywhere in the world. There's nowhere, I manage holistically in my home. Companies need to be managing holistically. Government policies need to be formed holistically. We're going to have to do that globally if we're to address climate change and these things. So if you're in an area where the grassland is predominantly annuals, you still need to manage holistically. Now, we've done a lot of that, particularly in the Cape in southern Africa, and people have already begun managing holistically in Australia in those areas. And most situations, certainly all the ones I've been associated with, the perennials, the perennial grasses had died out very rapidly and on a very large scale in the Mediterranean climates. And we don't fully understand the reason for that. Nobody's ever explained it to my satisfaction fully, but we do find if we begin to manage holistically, stop the overgrazing of plants, greatly increase the physical impact of animals on the land, perennial grassland begins to return. And that happens everywhere. And the planned grazing, holistic planned grazing, the process that we use to do that, people often say, well, will it apply here or there, to looking at different areas? I can just tell all of you on the webinar that in the development of that, over the years that we developed that process, we worked from the fringes of the Namib Desert in Africa, where there is no rainfall, it never rains. We worked from those fringes across 4 or 5 continents to the Alto Paraná in Paraguay, where we had over 100 inches of rain in tropical forest. And the exact same planning process, same planning charts are used everywhere, because ecological principles, cultural, economic, don't change on any boundary. So the same planning process, the same decision-making process is used absolutely everywhere. But the consequences are different on every farm. You can't step into the same river twice, it's flowing. So every farm is totally unique, but it's not only unique, it's unique every year, because the families are changing, marrying, dying, divorcing, whatever. The land is never the same 2 years running, and the economy you're operating is constantly fluctuating. So every farm is treated as totally unique every year. And that's why no prescribed management grazing system, mob grazing, anything like this ever worked.
Just to break it up a little bit, we might jump into, we've got a poll question on what has been your experience to date with managing holistically. You'll see that up on your screen. If people could have a look at those responses, which is very introductory understanding about holistic management, some understanding, familiar with the basics, currently successfully managing holistically and other, just so we can get a feel for how people see their situation. I think our challenge might be at the moment seeing what the actual response is, and that we don't have it up on my screen here. If we could leave that open for a moment. And if we could give you another couple of seconds and we'll shut that off. The results, everyone can see the results apart from Allan, but largely it's a decreasing scale from top to bottom, with most people saying they have an introductory understanding. So thank you very much for completing those. Just moving on to, we'll sort of maybe jump down into to a micro at the moment. We've got a question of, what is the signs in a pasture that tells you it's time to move your stock on?
What is it? What's your question? What is the signs?
No, sorry. We've got a question here from someone asking, well, how do I know when the pasture's telling me it's time to move?
Oh, the
stock
pasture
on?
won't. If the pasture is telling you it's time to move, you're late. You're stressing your animals. The planning should tell you when to move, and then you should be monitoring the plan and making sure you don't reach that point where the pasture's telling you, that's getting a bit late, you're not doing too well. So what regulates the move of the animals, everything is driven in the planned grazing, is driven from the recovery period. So when you're doing the planning, everything, as I said, is broken into small little steps you can deal with, and one of those steps will say, now in your situation, what recovery period are you going to use for the soil and the plants that have been grazed and trampled? And depending on your 100, 200-year rainfall record, your knowledge of that, you will determine that recovery period, but it's a very critical figure. You can change it as you gain experience. So when we start people off, we'll often say to them, use something no less than about a month, 30 days, and no more than about 3 months. So very commonly we might use a 60-day recovery or whatever, but it actually depends on what you're trying to do. What is your goal and what are you trying to do on that land? Because you're planning the grazing, you're using the livestock to reach certain goals, and you're making your decisions in that context. So if you're trying to maximize the water retention in that soil and the carbon retention in that soil, and that takes precedence over, say, worrying about individual animal performance, then I would use a longer recovery period to develop more grass root system, taking things down. If you are battling financially, you want to improve the land, but you're going to accept a slightly slower build-up of the soil there to make sure you're profitable right from the beginning, I might come down to, say, a 60-day recovery period so that I can move the animals more frequently and get them on a higher plane of nutrition more easily and get disturbance of that soil more frequently during the year, but still an adequate recovery period between. So it's a very critical decision, but you wouldn't go far wrong. All the earlier efforts I talked about with land where there was no grass or where we were bringing annual grassland back to perennial, we did almost all of those with round about 60-day, 2 months of recovery period. Now, people should not confuse that with the planning length, because when you're planning for droughts, you're sometimes planning 2 years ahead. I'm just talking about the recovery periods in that planning for the grass and the soil. I hope that's answered it.
Thank you, Alan. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left to go, so we'll just try and cram in a few more questions in the end. And I'm trying to interpret people's questions here. Can you briefly explain, Alan, what do you mean by overgrazing?
Overgrazing, if you look at it simply, just means that a plant has been bitten too frequently, bitten severely too frequently. When a grass plant is growing and is bitten severely, which it needs, basically the plant says, thanks mate, you've given me another 3 years of life. But what happens then is it mobilizes energy from roots and leaves roots and root hairs in the soil, but takes the energy from them to push up new green growth until it can capture enough sunlight and keep growing. But if the animals are still there, or the animal, could be one animal, is still there and it bites off that green growth that is coming from energy from roots and not directly from sunlight, that is overgrazing. So you could almost define it as the grazing of roots.
Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up with some of the questions here. Alan, you mentioned earlier, and there's a question here that's come in, what was it in 1984 that fell into place?
The holistic
what
context.
Was it? Yeah, right. Yeah.
The holistic context. And as I said, that was the most difficult to find because it was a totally new concept, not in any philosophy, religion, or science.
And then we've got a few questions still on that theme of how do you manage the impact on the economics and stock in the early stages of shifting?
There's only a body of knowledge attached to managing holistically in certain areas. So you can be managing holistically in any situation, a school, a business, anything, all right? But when we're managing holistically, the insights that enabled us to discover the framework and develop it, all right, those insights led us to realizing that we needed a new process to deal with livestock, if livestock were going to be used. And that's the holistic planned grazing. And that's unique to managing holistically. And we've realized we needed a new way of planning land. We no longer were limited by soil type and things like that. So there's a land planning. And we realized we needed a new way of looking at financial planning. So it's too long to go into here, but it embraces all of what was good in conventional budgeting, financial planning, in any well-run business, but some new aspects to it. And the best thing I can do to summarize it is that Deb Steiner and associates in Ohio State University studied early adopters across the United States from California to Florida who came to training with me and began to manage holistically, and they averaged 300% more profitability. Now, they were operating in the same banking system, same loans, same economic environment as other farmers, and over that same time period, approximately 600,000 American farmers went bankrupt in the same economy. And suicide was the leading farming cause of death. So it's very important for people to understand that if you're managing holistically, you should become more profitable almost immediately, very rapidly.
Allan, on a similar context, there's a question come in here, and I'll break with tradition and read it out almost verbatim. On a large cattle station in a monsoon climate, which has suffered over 100 years of constant grazing and overstocking, can we return it to its most natural state without impacting the economics of the production business?
Well, you can only return to sound economic and production by managing that holistically, and that suffered 100 years or more, not of overstocking, it was understocked, and of overgrazing of plants, but overresting the land, all that we've been talking about. So if I was on that station, I would have very little trouble indeed in beginning to make it more profitable and start guaranteeing increased production from here on. I mean, just by managing it holistically. No need to reinvent the wheel. Yeah.
And a sort of slightly pointy one is many of the benefits that emerge have been seen from holistic management purely as a result of better planning?
Yes, they are, but you've had people do wonderful planning, wonderful business planning, etc. The secret of the whole thing is making decisions holistically, managing holistically. That is the secret. Now, there have been many plagiarizations of my work. At last count, I think there were about 13.
I think we're getting very close to time. Allan, just to wrap up, is there anything left that you'd like to leave us with today before we move into
Well, just to encourage people to get involved, because it's so vital for your entire future of your cities, the whole of Australia, and how they can become involved is probably by connecting with our website and keeping up to date through that, because we are moving as fast as we can to provide learning hubs in every state in Australia, 100 of them around the world. We recently had people from 10 countries meeting with us in Boulder, establishing learning hubs, because we're not going to get leadership into the new agriculture that we need to address climate change, desertification. That leadership cannot come from politicians. It cannot come from any institution, university, organization. It can only come from ordinary people. So we're beginning to provide a way for ordinary people to begin to mobilize, learn to manage holistically. And those will be people from universities, from government agencies, from Landcare, but a place where they can all be learning together and spreading the knowledge rapidly. So just get involved. That's the first step.
And that probably leads me to a final question. It's one that I often hear from people as well. if we're interested, how do we make how do I start managing holistically? How do I make a start?
Well, you start managing holistically by learning about it. Now, people can buy the book. There's a handbook. There's e-books available from our training, from our website, and we'll constantly be updating that and improving it as we see what people are struggling with. I'm going to be coming out with a short book soon on governance, explaining the scientific reasons why no government today is capable of governing well, why you chop and change between political parties, because no party can produce sound policies today because it's all reductionist. So we're going to try and get that out to society, to civil society, and with simple ways forward where we can begin to address this. Because my whole life has been not about harping on and on about problems, but trying to find solutions. So we're just trying to mobilize people and let's start talking about solutions.
Well, thanks very much, Allan. I think on that basis, I'd like to thank Allan very much for your time. It's been particularly interesting today. I'd like to remind people about the survey and filling in the exit survey that's click on the tab on your screen. We'll have a recording up on my site probably within about a week, and I'll try and get a link out to all of those who have registered for today. But mostly thank you for registering, taking the time and effort for joining us today. As we mentioned earlier, the aim of these webinars is to expose people to a range of different approaches and allow you to draw your own conclusions. So that's the aim. I hope people certainly found it interesting today and thought-provoking, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich.